In a small-town diner, two cops try to humiliate a black homeless veteran just for ordering coffee, until Big Shaq makes one phone call that turns quiet injustice into national outrage. What starts as routine harassment ends in career-ending fallout, because when Big Shaq stands, silence shatters. And in that moment, the system learns who really holds the power. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun had barely climbed past the rooftops of Millstone, Georgia, one of those southern towns where time slowed down just enough for everyone to notice a stranger before they crossed the street. The paint on the town's only diner, Ruby's Spoon, was chipped, its coffee lukewarm, and its welcome selective. The open sign flickered in the window like it wasn't sure it meant it. At 9:17 a.m., the bell over the door gave a weak jingle as a man stepped inside. No one turned their head, not at first, but eyes drifted toward him, like dust pulled by gravity. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence asked the kind of questions people in Millstone didn't like answering. Jericho Boone was tall, lean, and draped in layers of faded fatigue. An old army jacket zipped high despite the warm spring morning. His boots were scuffed, laces uneven, and his beard had grown into a rough map of winters survived on concrete. A folded American flag peeked from the side pocket of his coat, the edges worn like a forgotten promise. He moved like someone used to waiting longer than most were willing to stay. He eased into the last booth by the window, the one with the peeling cushion and the sticky table. He didn't ask for a menu. He didn't even ask for water, just sat there, hands folded, eyes locked on the horizon through the glass, like he wasn't really looking at anything, just holding on to something the rest of the world couldn't see. The waitress, Lorraine, 64, silver hair pulled into a tight knot, pretended she didn't notice. She wiped the same spot on the counter for the third time, murmuring something to the cook behind the hatch. Her lips barely moved, but her eyes darted. The regulars, mostly retirees, contractors, and the same folks who'd been ordering the same damn grits for 2 tags, went quiet. Conversations thinned out like radio static when the dial loses its grip. It wasn't what Jericho had done. It was what he hadn't done. No smile, no nod, no y'all, just presence. And in towns like Millstone, that was an. Across from the counter sat a man, in a slate gray blazer, and a local real estate pin on his lapel. Chester Vance, former city council candidate, and full-time small-town big shot. He watched Jericho, with the kind of expression reserved for stray dogs sniffing around a child's birthday party. One eyebrow raised, lip curling like a question no one had asked him to answer. The tension was polite at first, the kind born of social muscle memory. But tension doesn't sit still. It collects, builds. Jericho shifted slightly, resting his hands on the table. His knuckles were calloused, a long scar arched across his wrist, mostly hidden under the jacket's cuff. He blinked slowly, a veteran's blink, not tired but trained. 10 minutes passed before Lorraine approached, holding the coffee pot like a weapon she wasn't sure she was ready to use. "We're out of biscuits," she said, pouring the black liquid into a chipped mug she placed before him. "Kitchen's behind." Jericho nodded once. "No thank you, no problem." Just silence, the kind that echoed louder than words ever could. The door jingled again. 2 officers entered. Officer Duke Randall led the way, sunglasses still on, even though the diner lighting barely warranted a squint. His partner Kyle Marin, younger, shorter, still carrying the kind of energy that made people shift in their seats, followed close behind. Their entrance didn't surprise anyone. This was routine. Morning walkthrough, say hi to Chester, grab a muffin, remind folks who kept order around here. But this time, they didn't stop at the counter. Their eyes zeroed in on Jericho. Chester gave a subtle nod toward the booth, like a man placing a bet he knew would land right. Duke approached first, hand resting on the holster he didn't need to use. Stance wide, Kyle lingered behind, scanning the diner like trouble might jump out of a coffee cup. Jericho didn't move. "Sir," Duke said, voice low, like he didn't want to scare the locals, but sure wanted them to hear. "You been loitering here long?" Jericho looked up, eyes steady, unreadable. The pause before he answered was a sentence in itself. "I'm waiting for my coffee," he said. Duke tilted his head, mock curious. "And how long you plan to wait for that?" Lorraine backed away slowly, wiping her hands with a napkin that didn't need wiping. "No harm done," Jericho replied. "Just sitting." Chester chuckled, loud enough to be part of the scene. Man's got nowhere else to be. Sounds like. Kyle took a step closer. You from around here? No, Jericho answered. Didn't think I had to be. Duke leaned in slightly. We've had some complaints. Jericho said nothing. No one had complained. Not officially. Not verbally. But in Millstone, all it took was discomfort to justify action. He wasn't loud. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even dirty. But his presence, that quiet, dignified stillness, was the kind of challenge men like Duke hated most. It was unshakable. Let's see some ID, Duke said. Jericho didn't move. I don't have it. Kyle shifted beside him. Then we've got a problem. Jericho looked past them, through the window, where the sky had turned a little darker despite the sun still burning above. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, just stared out like something bigger than all of them was waiting. Outside, from the farthest corner booth, a quiet rustle. A man unfolded his napkin, lifted his head, pulled back his hood. Shaquille O'Neal didn't need to say a word. But the air shifted when he moved. And everything, every smug glance, every false pretense, every quiet threat, suddenly found itself under shadow. The kind of shadow cast by a man who didn't need to raise his voice to shake a room. And just like that, the spark that had flickered into tension lit something far more dangerous. The fire hadn't started yet, but it would. And it would burn quiet. For now, the diner didn't breathe. It watched. The air inside Ruby's spoon had shifted the moment Jericho Boone entered. But now, with officers Duke Randall and Kyle Marin stepping further into the room, that air felt heavy, like static before a lightning strike. The worn soles of their boots tapped rhythmically against the linoleum floor, a sound more deliberate than their casual expressions let on. It wasn't a patrol, it was a performance. They didn't walk toward trouble. They made trouble adjust its seat to meet them halfway. Duke Randall had been in uniform long enough to know how to flex his presence without lifting a finger. His posture was built from hours of imposing over silence, leaning on power that didn't need justification. Just an audience. Kyle Marin, younger and still hungry, followed 2 steps behind like a shadow that hadn't yet learned when to stay in the dark. Their badges gleamed under the fluorescent diner lights, not as a beacon of trust, but as a subtle dare. They stopped beside Jericho's booth. No greetings, no questions. Just a beat of stillness, loud enough to fill every crevice of the room. You still sitting here? Duke asked, voice syrup thick, lips curled like he already had his answer. His tone wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Jericho didn't flinch. He didn't offer any explanation, nor apology. He met Duke's gaze without defiance, but with something far more unsettling. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from someone who's already lost everything that could be taken from him. The kind of calm that's unfamiliar to men who wield fear like a weapon. Kyle took a slow step closer, scanning Jericho from boots to collar. You didn't order anything, he said. This ain't a shelter. You know that, right? Jericho reached for the coffee mug. Lorraine had poured earlier. It was still steaming faintly, untouched. He raised it slowly, took a sip, and placed it back down with care. The room heard the soft clink of ceramic on formica, as if it were thunder. I'm drinking, Jericho said, the first full sentence he'd spoken since the cops arrived. Duke's jaw flexed. Kyle looked toward the counter, where Lorraine had all but vanished behind a cloud of nerves and indecision. Chester Vance sat up straighter, as if watching a show he had paid extra to see. The rest of the diner barely moved. Forks hung midair. Spoons paused mid-sip. The town had seen drama, sure, but not like this. This wasn't shouting. This wasn't mess. This was quiet pressure, slow and winding like a fuse crawling toward the powder. We've had reports, Duke muttered. No one reported anything, Jericho replied. Steady. Kyle clicked his tongue. We got eyes, man. We don't need a report to know when someone don't belong. That line sliced sharper than it sounded. In Millstone, don't belong carried more weight than 4 syllables ever should. Jericho didn't respond. He just looked out the window again, his reflection in the glass ghosting over the face of a man who had already fought wars far worse than this one. But he knew this war too. This one was quieter, slimmer, more dangerous in its silence. Kyle leaned a little too close, fingertips brushing the edge of Jericho's table. You got ID? No. Name? Jericho didn't blink. Jericho Boone. Duke chuckled. A short, bitter sound. Well, Jericho Boone, we're gonna have to ask you to step outside for a little talk. Jericho didn't move. Not causing trouble, he said. Trouble doesn't need to shout to be trouble, Duke replied. That's when it happened. Quietly, subtly, from the booth near the entrance, A hand reached inside a purse. A phone emerged, screen tilted low, lens angled upward. The recording started. No beeps, no flashes, just a steady red dot, blinking in time, with the injustice unspooling a few feet away. The person holding the phone was Talia Monroe, a 29-year-old substitute teacher who'd stopped in for her usual biscuit and jam before heading to the elementary school. She hadn't expected to play witness to history or be the catalyst for it, but something about the scene, about the way Jericho's silence was being stacked against him like evidence in a crime he hadn't committed, stirred something raw inside her. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't need to. All she knew was that she was watching something she couldn't ignore. So she pressed record. Duke noticed the movement, a beat too late. His eyes flicked toward the phone, but quickly returned to Jericho. He knew better than to engage a camera. Not yet. You got a place you sleep, Jericho? Kyle asked now, pretending this was just casual conversation. You a drifter? Veteran, Jericho said. Honorable discharge, Duke smirked. And yet here you are, sipping our coffee, scaring the locals. Jericho looked down at his hands, folded neatly, calmly. Not scared of me, he said. Scared of the story they think I tell. For a split second, Duke looked rattled, not by volume, but by accuracy. He didn't like that. This wasn't how it usually went. Normally, people got nervous, defensive, loud. But Jericho was unshakable. And that made him dangerous, not in the way officers feared for their safety, but in the way men like Duke feared for their illusion of control. He straightened his back. I'm gonna have to ask you to come with us. Jericho didn't answer, because he didn't need to. From the far end of the diner, the sound of a chair sliding back interrupted everything. The scrape was soft but sharp, like a line being drawn. The giant who had been sitting silently at the corner booth all morning finally stood. He didn't move toward the table. He didn't call out. He didn't even make eye contact. Shaquille O'Neal simply pulled out his phone and tapped the screen once. He wasn't recording. He was calling. Not to make a scene, but to start a sequence. Duke noticed. Kyle noticed. Everyone noticed. And suddenly, the entire temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. Because Shaq didn't just bring attention, he brought accountability. And in that instant, everyone realized something had shifted. The game was no longer theirs. And the target? Well, the target had just found his shield. In the quiet chaos building inside Ruby's Spoon, there was one man no one had noticed. He sat tucked deep into the back corner booth, nearly swallowed by shadow and flannel. The hood of his gray sweatshirt was drawn low over his brow, casting a curtain across a face the world once cheered for. To most, he looked like any other big man keeping to himself. But his stillness wasn't born of disinterest. It was study. It was focus. The kind you only learn when the stakes are too high to blink. Shaquille Big Shaq. O'Neal was not in Millstone by accident. His name wasn't on any guest list. No media knew he was passing through. And he hadn't come with cameras or speeches. He was on his way to meet a friend in the neighboring town. Just passing through, when a familiar diner with a reputation for sweet potato pie pulled him off the interstate. But fate doesn't need a headline to do its work. It only needs timing. From his booth, Shaq watched the encounter unfold without flinching. No smirk, no scowl, just those unblinking, observant eyes fixed on the scene playing out between Jericho Boone and the officers. His spoon rested inside a half-eaten bowl of gumbo. Forgot. His fingers tapped once against the edge of the table, not out of restlessness, but rhythm, measured, like a clock ticking down towards something that hadn't yet named itself. He'd seen this kind of scene before. Too many times. It always started with posture, the officers taking a stance too wide for the situation. Then the tone mock courtesy laced with power. Then the language, not foul but precise, designed to press buttons, to bait reaction, to document anything that could be turned into justification later. But Jericho Boone didn't play along. And that, Shaq knew, was what made the tension dangerous. The younger officer Kyle had begun circling the table now, each step slower than necessary, as if he were inspecting a museum piece instead of a man drinking coffee. Duke stayed rooted in place, his gaze narrowing with each breath Jericho took without shrinking. This was no longer about trespassing. It wasn't even about loitering. It was about control. And control was slipping. From her booth near the entrance, Talia Monroe's phone kept recording. Lens steady. Her heart pounded as her thumb hovered near the pause button. unsure if continuing would put her in danger. But she didn't stop. Because something about the way Shaq hadn't moved reassured her. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. But the man in the hoodie felt like anchor weight in a room full of shaking walls. Kyle reached for Jericho's arm. It wasn't violent, not technically, but it was unnecessary. Jericho didn't resist. But he also didn't cooperate easily. He rose slowly, as if his bones weighed more than most. His eyes never left Duke's face. "You can't sit where folks don't want you," Duke muttered. "I sat because I exist," Jericho replied, voice low but clear. That was enough. Duke took out his cuffs, clicked them once, loud and deliberate, like punctuation on a sentence no one finished writing. "You're being detained," he said. For failure to comply, Jericho offered no protest. He simply turned, presented his wrists, and allowed himself to be bound. He didn't hang his head, didn't plead. Just stood tall, with steel in his spine. The diner was silent. Until Shaq stood. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't showy. But it felt seismic. The scraping of his chair across the tile floor made every head turn. All 6 feet 11 inches of him unfolded like a statue waking from slumber. His hood fell back slightly as he straightened, revealing just enough of his face to remove all doubt. The silence in the diner turned electric. Shaquille O'Neal didn't move toward the officers. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen once. He didn't have to speak for everyone to know it. Wasn't just any call. On the other end of that line was someone who answered on the first ring. Someone who owed Shaq not just a favor, but respect. The kind that bends policy and rearranges timelines. The call didn't need to be loud, because the consequences would echo loudly enough. He spoke into the phone, voice low, clipped, just names and times, badge numbers and location. Then he ended it. No threats. No demands. Just accountability set in motion. Duke had frozen mid-step, his hands hovering near his utility belt. Kyle stared wide-eyed at Shaq like he'd just realized they'd been playing poker with someone holding the house keys. Jericho didn't speak. Shaq didn't look at him. He didn't need to. It was already understood. In that diner, a new line had been drawn. Not with shouts, not with fists, but with presence. And from that moment, everyone knew this wasn't going away quietly. The recording continued. But the story had just shifted. The room held its breath as Shaquille O'Neal took that first step away from his corner booth. His presence, already heavy even in silence, now pressed into every crack of Ruby's spoon like shifting tectonic plates. There were no camera flashes, no security entourage, no announcement to accompany him. Just the soft creak of aged tile beneath sneakers, the size of a grown man's future. And yet as he walked toward the center of the tension, it felt as though the diner itself leaned back to make space for him. Duke Randall blinked twice, unsure if his eyes had tricked him. Recognition lit across his face, flickering fast like a fuse that wasn't supposed to burn. Shaq's reputation preceded him. Global icon, businessman, philanthropist. But it was his calm, grounded nature that made men like Duke feel momentarily off balance. Still, egos sharpen easily when faced with authority they can't control. Kyle Marin stood stiffer now, fidgeting with the end of his belt, unsure whether to square up or step down. Neither man moved. Shaq didn't walk fast, but each step carried the weight of someone who had watched injustice in too many forms, in too many places, to stand still in the presence of another. He said nothing. His silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. Like the quiet before thunder, it didn't announce itself, but it promised consequence. Jericho Boone stood still in cuffs, his gaze fixed not on Shaq but on the horizon outside the window. Even in the moment's intensity, his stillness remained intact, the kind that didn't seek rescue, but also didn't refuse a witness. He wasn't asking to be saved. He was asking to be seen. Shaq stopped a few feet from the officers. He didn't cross into confrontation. He didn't invade space. But his presence was enough to shift the temperature of the room. A new energy hung in the air. Dense, deliberate, unshakable. He reached into his coat pocket. The phone emerged again. No frantic dialing. No nervous hands. Just a calm, precise tap on the screen. The phone rose to his ear. There was no need to raise his voice. No need to name drop. He spoke plainly, measured words loaded with the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "This is Shaquille O'Neal," he began, steady as bedrock. "I'm reporting an incident at Ruby's Spoon in Millstone, Georgia. 2 officers, One black male, veteran, being detained without cause. He paused. Names? Badge numbers. Got him. Officer Duke Randall. Officer Kyle Marin. He said those names, like they were being engraved on something permanent. There was no anger in his tone. That was what made it cut deeper. It was pure accounting. A list being submitted into a system that couldn't pretend it hadn't been warned. Video footage is being recorded. Multiple witnesses. Time is 9:43. His eyes never left Duke's. Not once. He didn't have to threaten careers. He didn't need to mention lawsuits, or networks, or power. He had already made his move, and the ripple of that call had started to travel faster than anyone in the room could calculate. Somewhere, on the other end of the line, a chain of professionals had already begun documenting, cross-checking, and preparing for scrutiny. Duke shifted in place, trying to find his footing again. His grip on the cuffs had loosened slightly, but his voice came back, strained through layers of resentment. Look, sir, we've got a situation. No, Shaq cut in, finally speaking directly to them. His voice wasn't loud, but it was immovable. You had an opportunity. You turned it into a situation. The diner was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights, and the low ping of an order bell in the kitchen that no one answered. Kyle looked to Duke, eyes uncertain now, like a kid realizing the substitute teacher used to be a Marine. We didn't touch him, Kyle said defensively, his voice cracking just slightly. We were just asking questions. While he was drinking coffee, Shaq replied. In a public diner, you escalated because you didn't know who was watching. Shaq looked around the room, not for drama, but to check the temperature. Every booth had eyes now. Silent witnesses. Talia Monroe's phone was still recording, her hands steady. A trucker near the window had started live streaming. An older couple in the back whispered to each other, glancing down at a police brochure that now felt like a collector's item from a broken promise. Shaq turned his attention back to Jericho. He didn't ask if he was okay. He didn't need to. Respect is often quieter than concern. He looked at the cuffs, then back at Duke. You're going to uncuff him, Shaq said. It wasn't a request. It was just the next step in a chain that had already begun to move. Duke hesitated for a second too long, then sighed and reached for the key. Kyle didn't move. He watched, jaw clenched, pride fighting reality. Duke turned the lock. The cuffs fell away with a soft clink against Jericho's jacket. Jericho didn't rub his wrists. He didn't step away. He simply exhaled, long and deep, like releasing a weight that didn't belong to him. Shaq stepped back, returning to his phone. Yeah, he said into the line. He's uncuffed now. But I'll be staying a while. Make sure it stays that way. He ended the call. Duke stepped back, fuming but wordless. Kyle looked like he wanted to disappear. Chester Vance, who'd been watching from the counter with popcorn-style interest, suddenly turned back to his eggs like he didn't want any part of what came next. Shaq didn't return to his seat. He stayed standing, quietly towering over the tension like a monument to what restraint, presence, and integrity could look like when wrapped in the body of a legend. He didn't need applause. He didn't want attention. He wanted accountability. And today, he got it. The ripple started the moment Shaq ended the call. Not a tidal wave, not yet, but the kind of subtle tremor that snakes beneath the surface before the ground gives out. While Ruby's spoon returned to a brittle hush, and officers Duke Randall and Kyle Marin tried to gather what remained of their composure. The true shift was already underway, far from Millstone, deep in the marble and paper halls of state accountability. In a corner office lit by the cruel fluorescence of state-funded oversight, Delaney North picked up her phone on the second ring. She wasn't expecting a call that morning, and certainly not one from him. Delaney didn't startle easily. In her 13 years as a senior ethics investigator at the State Civil Review Bureau, she had exposed a bribery chain in the Augusta Corrections Division, dismantled an internal affairs cover-up in Waycross, and quietly made enemies in high places, with a pen more dangerous than a badge. She wasn't famous. She was effective. And Shaquille O'Neal knew precisely why he called her. Del, Shaq had said. Nothing fancy. Just the tone of a man who didn't speak unless it mattered. You'll want this one. She listened. Jotted notes. No fluff. Just data. Location. Names. Time. And one word that snapped her spine upright. Recording. Delaney hung up, turned to her screen, and opened a case file template. The words came quick, with the sharp rhythm of someone not documenting but diagnosing. The moment she keyed in Officer Randall and Officer Marin, her database bled red. What had happened at the diner wasn't new. It was just visible now. Delaney's fingers danced across keys as she pulled internal reports from Millstone's precinct archive. Complaints of harassment, unfiled citations, body cam discrepancies. Names began to recur like bad refrains. Randall, Marin, and worse, their supervisor, Captain Roland Rowe, a 30-year veteran with a reputation for cleaning house, anytime someone tried to raise a red flag. Rowe's name wasn't unfamiliar to Delaney. A minor blip from a few years back. A prisoner transfer that mysteriously disappeared. A whistleblower whose testimony was dismissed on a technicality. Nothing concrete, but the smell had lingered. Now, thanks to Shaq, she had the matchstick she needed. Delaney didn't request an interview with the officers. Not yet. She subpoenaed body cam footage first, but found gaps, convenient gaps. According to the digital timestamp, Randall's cam hadn't activated until after Jericho Boone was uncuffed. Marin's had been turned off due to battery failure. A lie so thin it was practically translucent. She flagged the incident under potential obstruction and marked it as urgent. Then she started pulling thread. Jericho Boone's name led her down an unexpected corridor. A discharge file, honorable as stated, was attached to a classified clearance record from his time in the Navy. What stood out wasn't the discharge itself, but the timing weeks after he submitted a formal internal complaint about a logistics firm funneling military-grade equipment through privately subcontracted security firms, many of which had stateside connections to local enforcement agencies, including Millstone. It clicked. This wasn't just harassment. It was about keeping a man like Jericho invisible. Forgettable. If his life was buried beneath citations, vagrancy charges, and police interactions, his credibility would rot quietly. No one would believe a drifter with a jacket and a flag in his pocket when he said he saw things he wasn't supposed to see. Delaney leaned back in her chair. She wasn't looking at a bad cop anymore. She was looking at a contained network, one that had learned how to insulate itself under the guise of small-town oversight. Millstone wasn't just a sleepy Georgia town. It was a funnel point, a node in a larger web where people disappeared, where voices quieted, where stories went unfiled. She didn't call Shaq back. She didn't need to. She contacted the Bureau's legal liaison and requested emergency clearance to open an unannounced precinct audit on Millstone's department, citing inconsistencies in filed reports and a potential systemic breach of conduct policy. The order was signed within hours, and then she reached out to a man named Garvey Trent, a documentary journalist with a record of exposing rural corruption, with nothing more than a mic, a camera, and a sixth sense for suppressed stories. She gave him only 3 words: Ruby's spoon footage. He was on the next bus out. Meanwhile, in Millstone, the pressure cooker began to hiss. Duke Randall walked into the precinct the next morning to find that his access to case files had been suspended. Kyle Marin was pulled aside by internal affairs and questioned about prior arrests made without backup. Captain Rowe dismissed it all as bureaucratic itch, but even he knew this wasn't a random check-in. This had fingerprints. Big ones. Shaq-sized ones. But what Rowe didn't see coming was the public. The footage Talia Monroe had posted had now crossed state lines, picked up by local affiliates, and amplified by civil rights accounts that knew exactly what to do with a video like this. It wasn't just about optics anymore. It was about evidence. There was audio. You could hear the restraint in Jericho's voice. You could hear the clipped tones of Randall's posturing. You could hear Shaq say badge numbers with the same finality as a courtroom gavel. Millstone wasn't just on the map. It was under the microscope. And Delaney North? She was sharpening the scalpel. 6. The veteran's truth. Jericho Boone was never just a drifter. The world had seen Jericho Boone through a narrow lens. A drifter. A nameless veteran. A man with tired boots and a hollowed coat. But beneath that camouflage of neglect was a record carved in discipline, honor, and inconvenient truth. Through Delaney North's relentless investigation, the real story began to unravel. And what it revealed wasn't just an injustice. It was a scandal concealed beneath a patchwork of bureaucracy, fear, and silence. It started with the digital fingerprints buried deep inside a Department of Defense subdirectory. Jericho's name was tied to an old Navy file, archived but flagged restricted clearance, an oddity considering his discharge was labeled honorable. The more Delaney probed, the more inconsistencies appeared. Paper trails that led nowhere, performance evaluations that abruptly ended, and references to a contractor named Veriton Logistics, whose operations Delaney had encountered once before in a completely different case. Jericho had once been chief cryptologic technician Boone, stationed in Bahrain, then later transferred to a secure comms node in San Diego. He was decorated twice, once for intelligence interception that foiled an insurgent ambush, and once for digital systems restructuring that saved over $4 million in federal overhead. His personnel file, which Delaney acquired through a quiet request to an old contact in the Navy's Civilian Oversight Office, painted a picture of a meticulous, brilliant analyst with zero disciplinary flags, until 1 month before his discharge. That's when the language changed. Unstable, uncooperative, security risk. All three appeared in the same week. Delaney dug deeper. The week in question followed a memo Jericho had drafted, quietly flagged for the Department of Naval Intelligence. The subject line, unlawful routing of surplus military assets to civilian vendors. The document alleged that Veritin Logistics, under subcontract from the military, was redirecting outdated but functioning equipment, surveillance drones, encrypted laptops, even riot-grade protective gear to private prison corporations under falsified salvage invoices. The paper trail implicated several state-level buyers, including the Millstone County Corrections Board. Jericho hadn't just seen it. He documented it. He wasn't unstable. He was a threat. Within 6 weeks of filing the memo, Jericho was reassigned, evaluated, and given 2 choices: accept a medical discharge based on fabricated psychological assessments, or face a court-martial for compromised operational judgment. He chose the discharge. He had family then, a daughter in college, and he thought silence might protect them both. But silence doesn't always end the noise. Sometimes, it makes you easier to bury. Delaney stared at the document trail for hours, each click confirming a suspicion she didn't want to admit, that Jericho had been neutralized, not by accident, but with precision. His accusations never saw daylight. His security clearance was revoked, and once discharged, he became what bureaucracies fear least: a man without a platform. After the Navy, Jericho tried to work civilian jobs. He taught part-time, consulted for a local IT firm, but every background check seemed to surface flagged inconsistencies. Contracts vanished, interviews dried up, his savings eroded, his dignity followed close behind. Eventually his house was foreclosed. His daughter, whose tuition he'd scraped together with old medals and cashed-out bonds, dropped out and disappeared from state records. He lost touch with her completely. By the time he wandered into Ruby Spoon and Millstone, Jericho Boone had become the kind of ghost society conveniently forgets. A name no longer associated with bravery or integrity, just suspicion and shadows. But now Delaney had proof. The most damning piece came from an internal email she recovered between a former Veritin Logistics auditor and a liaison from Millstone's law enforcement procurement office. The message, dated 2 years after Jericho's discharge, mentioned prior internal obstruction attempts neutralized, and made reference to external actors now listed as transient liabilities. It was bureaucratic euphemism. Cold, precise, but it was enough to confirm what Jericho had long suspected. Someone wanted him discredited and invisible. Millstone had become a holding pen, a town where a man like Jericho could be contained without needing to be erased. Delaney packaged her findings into a classified brief and sent it directly to the Civil Review Bureau's federal liaison. But before that, she forwarded a redacted version to Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq read every word, and for the first time since the diner, his stillness broke. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Recognition. Understanding. He saw Jericho not as a man rescued, but as a man restored. Shaq knew all about being the center of the room, about being seen before being understood. But this was about being misunderstood on purpose. A tactical effort to turn a decorated serviceman into a suspect by erasing his truth, one paper at a time. Shaq didn't go public. That wasn't his move. Instead, he made 2 more quiet calls, one to a private veterans legal defense network he'd helped fund, but never named. The second to a pro bono investigative journalist working with a digital rights organization in Atlanta. He told both of them the same thing: "You'll want to hear this man's story." Jericho Boone wasn't told about the brief right away. He didn't ask for redemption. He had spent years learning to survive without the luxury of hope. But when Delaney finally approached him face to face, file in hand, his expression didn't change much. He only asked one question: "Does it say my daughter's name?" Delaney paused. "No," she answered quietly, "but we'll find her." For the first time in years, Jericho's shoulders relaxed. Not in relief, but in readiness. Because the truth had surfaced, and with it, a reckoning. Not just for the men who cuffed him, but for the system that tried to rewrite his legacy. What Shaq did in that diner wasn't charity. It was alignment. A man of voice making space for a man whose silence had been weaponized. The world would soon know Jericho Boone. Not as a drifter, but as a warrior they tried to erase and failed. By the third day after the incident at Ruby Spoon, the clip of Jericho Boone being handcuffed without cause had eclipsed the borders of Millstone, Georgia. It no longer lived solely on Talia Monroe's phone or in the inboxes of civil rights advocates. It had become a nationwide firestorm. The footage aired in split screens beside news anchors in every major city. Social media threads dissected every second, from the moment Duke Randall's hand hovered over his cuffs to the exact instant Shaq made his now legendary call. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire: Justice for Jericho, Shaq stands, and Millstone uncovered. For officers Randall and Marin, the pressure came in waves. First, a wave of digital condemnation. Comments, reposts, name tags, phone calls to the station from every area code in the country. Then came the local protests. Peaceful, organized, steady. They weren't massive, but they were relentless. Every morning, a small crowd gathered outside the precinct, holding signs and reading Jericho's service record aloud, line by line, like scripture. Inside the station, the tension grew thick enough to choke on. Duke paced the halls like a man walking over ice, his swagger slowly collapsing under the weight of consequence. The confidence he once wore like armor began to flake away. He tried to spin the narrative, told Captain Rowe that they were just following protocol, that the man was acting suspicious, and that they de-escalated once they knew who Shaq was. But the words didn't land the way they used to. Captain Rowe, a heavy-set man with a crimson face and a voice like worn gravel, didn't say much during that first briefing. He just stared. Not at Duke, not at Kyle, at the table between them, like he was calculating the cost of a collapse already in motion. Because Rowe knew this wasn't about a single incident. The audit Delaney North had triggered was in full swing now, and it was pulling skeletons from every file cabinet the Millstone precinct had managed to keep locked for decades. Civil complaints that were marked unsubstantiated were reopened. Body cam footage long believed lost was miraculously recovered through third-party cloud backups. And beneath it all, a pattern emerged, one that no PR firm, no late-night apology letter, and no hushed phone call to a friendly judge could cover. A pattern of targeted citations, issued disproportionately to black residents. A pattern of dropped charges followed by retaliatory traffic stops. A pattern of internal review forms, altered or misfiled. Randall and Marin were far from the only names surfacing, but they were the ones in the spotlight. Their faces were on the news. Their actions were on tape, and their behavior fit the script all too well. Kyle Marin, younger and more malleable, cracked first. He showed up at the precinct one morning, unshaven, eyes sunken, and asked to speak with internal affairs alone. For 4 hours, he told them everything: how Duke led, how Rowe ignored, how cases were padded, and how complaint reviews were handled off record. He gave them email threads. He gave them text messages. He gave them the quiet corruption that had stitched itself into the seams of Millstone PD. And he gave them one more thing: a name. Sergeant Lena Dreiss, an officer who had transferred out a year ago after filing her own complaint about Rowe's leadership. Her report had never been escalated, buried under a pile of pending review paperwork. Now, it was evidence. Captain Rowe didn't see the hammer coming. He thought he still had friends in high places. But what he hadn't accounted for was how much Shaquille O'Neal's quiet involvement amplified everything. Shaq didn't give interviews. He didn't posture. He simply kept showing up, donating to the legal fund for Jericho's case, forwarding Delaney's findings to a select group of journalists, and most effectively, refusing to let the story die. And it didn't die. Instead, it morphed into something bigger. An online collective of ex-veterans began pulling records of their own abuses at the hands of law enforcement. An investigative podcast picked up the trail and launched a 6-part series titled Buried in Millstone. Civil rights attorneys began showing up to the protests outside the station, handing out cards, gathering names, and connecting stories. Each thread wove a broader narrative, each voice echoing the same haunting idea: this wasn't a fluke, it was a blueprint. Rowe responded the only way he knew how: defensively. He held a press conference, flanked by 2 county officials and a barely functioning mic. He called the accusations political, insisted on a full review by internal mechanisms, and warned against rushing to judgment before the facts are clear. But the room wasn't buying it. Journalists, armed with Delaney's dossier and Kyle's leaked statement, fired off questions like arrows. Rowe flinched with each one. By the end of that week, the Civil Review Bureau issued a formal recommendation: Captain Roland Rowe to be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending criminal investigation. Duke Randall was suspended without pay. Kyle Marin resigned before the paperwork hit his desk. The badge didn't protect them anymore. It burned. Delaney North, as methodical as ever, submitted a follow-up brief to the Department of Justice requesting broader oversight for the entire Millstone precinct. She listed Jericho's case not as a standalone incident, but as the catalyst in a pattern of documented abuse. And Shaq? He remained on the move. No interviews. No ribbon cuttings. Just quiet calls. Quiet checks. Quiet presence. He'd been in rooms where players shouted stats and contracts and bravado. This movement required none of that. Only consistency. Only truth. Because now the walls weren't just closing in on the guilty. They were opening up for the silenced. 8. The call heard round the world. The video moved faster than anyone anticipated. What began as a quietly recorded moment in a sleepy Georgia diner became a cultural tremor. Within 48 hours, the clip had surpassed 2 million views. By the end of the week, it was airing on evening broadcasts, looping on subway platforms, retweeted by athletes, actors, and activists alike. Not because it was violent, there was no punch thrown, no weapon drawn, but because it showed something deeper. A confrontation so subtle it might have been missed if not for what followed. Shaquille O'Neal's silent intervention, his single phone call, and the unmistakable shift in power that came after it. People didn't just share it, they studied it, frame by frame. The moment Jericho Boone raised his coffee cup, the tightening of Officer Randall's jaw, the angle of the phone in Talia Monroe's hands, and then the quiet rise of Shaq from the booth in the corner. The call, the silence, the unraveling. Commentators labeled it the diner reckoning. Bloggers praised its restraint, calling it a masterclass in dignity versus ego. And while the world debated, dissected, and digested the footage, the man at the center of it, Shaquille O'Neal, remained almost entirely silent. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't step onto any talk shows or live streams. His social media remained sparse. No threads, no hashtags, just a single post 3 days after the footage went viral. It's not about going viral, it's about stopping the cycle. That was all he said publicly. Privately, he moved like a tide beneath the surface. He made quiet donations to 3 different civil rights organizations in Georgia, all of whom had previously struggled to fund legal teams capable of challenging municipal injustice. He contacted the family of a former Millstone youth who'd been wrongly detained and offered to cover the costs of his re-education and therapy. And most notably, he initiated funding for 3 separate federal civil lawsuits, none under his name, all rooted in cases Delaney North had unearthed during her audit. One involved a teenage boy falsely charged and held without bail. Another was linked to a woman wrongfully evicted after a retaliatory citation. The third, a wrongful death case quietly buried 2 years earlier, under lack of evidence, now reopened with new counsel. None of these actions were attached to his public image. The media speculated, of course. Articles hinted at an anonymous benefactor, but those close to the movement knew exactly who was behind it. And that, Shaq understood, was enough. When he did speak, it was during a low-key town hall meeting in Atlanta, not even hosted in Millstone. It wasn't televised. There was no red carpet, no stage. He sat on a folding chair among a semicircle of youth advocates, educators, and veterans. Someone asked him why he hadn't spoken sooner. He nodded slowly before responding. "I didn't need to speak," he said. "Y'all saw it. You know what it is." A pause. Then, something more. "This isn't about me versus them. That's too easy. This is about seeing the pattern and choosing not to let it sit anymore. Jericho's story isn't rare. That's the problem. It's normal, it's common, and if we keep pretending it's isolated, we're lying to ourselves." He never mentioned the officers by name, never pointed fingers. His words weren't dripping with rage. They were shaped by reflection, by experience, by knowing what it means to be watched, and measured and misunderstood. He wasn't there to cancel careers. He was there to disrupt complacency. His restraint became the story. Cable networks tried to spin his silence into mystery. Some pundits questioned whether he should have spoken louder. Others praised him for letting the moment breathe. But beyond the debate, one truth had crystallized in the minds of millions. Shaquille O'Neal had shifted something fundamental, not through fury or spectacle, but through presence, patience, and an unwillingness to let a man like Jericho Boone vanish into statistics. In schools across the South, teachers played the clip in civics classes. Law students in New York wrote papers on the legal implications of civilian video documentation. Podcasters dissected the psychology of power, analyzing Shaq's role as the bystander who refused to stay seated. But for Shaq, the attention wasn't the point. The point was Jericho, and all the people like him. Because there were thousands. Men and women carrying folded flags and unanswered calls. People whose stories never got filmed, whose arrests were never challenged, whose names never trended. Shaq knew that he couldn't fix everything. But what he could do, what he chose to do, was ensure that when the system tried to eat one more man, one more vet, one more soul, someone was paying attention. Someone had reach. Someone had voice. Back in Millstone, as protests gave way to reform proposals, the town began to look itself in the mirror. Churches opened their doors to community forums. A local pastor started a weekly healing service focused on truth-telling, and Jericho Boone, once a ghost in his own country, was invited to speak at the reopening of the town's Memorial Plaza. He didn't accept right away. He wasn't sure if the crowd would want him, but Shaq called him once more and said only, "They need to hear it from you now." Jericho said yes. And as he stood at that podium weeks later, in front of strangers and neighbors alike, he didn't mention the diner. He didn't name the officers. He just held up the faded flag he carried everywhere, and said, "This used to mean something to me. Then I thought it stopped meaning anything. But today, I'm giving it one more chance." The applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady. The kind that builds. Just like change. In the weeks following the diner incident, the weight of consequence descended hard and fast across Millstone. The aftershocks weren't just bureaucratic. They were cultural. The town that once prided itself on being quiet, clean, and proud, found itself at the center of a reckoning that had no interest in returning to the status quo. National attention hadn't just peeled back the layers of misconduct. It had laid bare a culture of convenience, where looking away was easier than holding mirrors up to power. The first domino fell with Captain Rollin Rowe's resignation. It wasn't voluntary. After weeks of refusing comment, hiding behind vague departmental memos, and dismissive soundbites, the pressure finally became unignorable. The audit report filed by Delaney North and her team revealed more than inconsistencies. It uncovered years of intentional oversight failures, a pattern of buried civilian complaints, and a disturbing trail of administrative redactions that suggested more than laziness. It suggested complicity. Internal Affairs gave Rowe the opportunity to retire with dignity. He declined. His resignation letter was as cold as his leadership had been. 4 lines, no apologies. Just a flat citation of irreconcilable public pressure and operational compromise. There was no press conference, no farewell ceremony. His office was emptied overnight, and the locks were changed before morning. Following Rowe, the hammer came down on officers Duke Randall and Kyle Marin. The charges: falsified police reports, failure to activate body cameras, misconduct during detainment, and intentional misrepresentation of a civilian's status. Their termination came with unusual speed, just 12 days after the diner incident, due in part to the massive wave of public attention and the now viral clip that offered no room for interpretation. The indictment was the real shock. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a formal federal investigation into their conduct, not only for what they did to Jericho Boone, but for what they had done across multiple stops and citations over the last 4 years. Multiple names surfaced, people who had once been written off, now coming forward with stories that eerily echoed Jericho's own. Randall lawyered up and refused to speak publicly. Marin, however, released a statement through his attorney, citing regret and institutional pressure for his actions. It was an attempt at redemption, but the words rang hollow. He had chosen his role. Now he was living the cost of it. But while the fallout swept through the ranks of the Millstone PD, Jericho Boone's life began to rebuild. The first sign came not through paperwork, but through silence. The silence that followed the erasure of every bogus charge, every citation, every false flag on his public record. Delaney North personally called to confirm it. "Clean slate," she told him. "No conditions. You're free." Jericho didn't cry. He didn't cheer. He simply closed his eyes and nodded, like a man who had carried an invisible weight for too long, now unsure how to walk without it. Then came the job offer. It arrived not through a recruiter, not through a formal agency, but in a quiet letter. No fanfare, no bolded header, just a simple envelope hand-delivered to the veteran shelter where Jericho had been temporarily housed. The sender, Rest Point Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping disenfranchised veterans reintegrate into civilian life through therapy, job training, and most importantly, community rebuilding. Inside the letter was an offer to serve as Veteran Outreach Director, a role that would pay decently, come with housing support, and offer Jericho one thing he hadn't had in years: purpose. What Jericho didn't know, at least not at first, was that Rest Point had been quietly funded for over a decade by none other than Shaquille O'Neal. Not for publicity, not for applause, just because he'd seen too many men come home to silence. Men like Jericho. Jericho didn't accept immediately. He took 3 days to walk the length of the town, the streets he once drifted through unseen. He sat in the same booth at Ruby's Spoon, nodding politely to Lorraine, who poured his coffee this time, without flinching. He stood outside the courthouse where so many stories like his had gone to die. Then, on the 4th morning, he signed the letter and mailed it back. Shaq didn't attend the signing ceremony. He didn't need to, but he sent a message, handwritten, folded neatly inside a navy blue envelope. You stood when others tried to erase you. Now build something they can't ignore. Proud of you. Redemption didn't come with fireworks. It came with slow trust. The town began to shift. Piece by piece. The mayor's office announced a new civilian review board composed of community leaders, teachers, and veterans. The police department launched mandatory empathy and ethics training, not as a PR stunt, but as part of a binding agreement with the Civil Review Bureau. Jericho himself was invited to speak at the precinct, not to forgive, but to educate. He accepted. His words were simple. I don't need you to apologize to me, he told the room of young cadets. I need you to make sure no one else ends up where I did, forgotten for doing the right thing. And they listened, because the man in front of them wasn't just a symbol. He was proof that systems could break and still be rebuilt. That the story didn't have to end in bitterness or vengeance. That redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about confronting it, reshaping it, and offering something better in its place. The headlines faded eventually. The hashtags moved on. But in Millstone, something stayed. A seed had been planted in policy, in culture, in conscience. And where once there had been erasure, now there was presence. Where once there had been silence, now there was a voice. 10. Big Shaq's quiet exit. A legend leaves a wake. Shaquille O'Neal never returned to Ruby's Spoon. Not because he was unwelcome, on the contrary. The diner scrubbed its walls, upgraded its booths, and even framed a still from the security camera footage showing the moment he stood, towering but calm. But Shaq didn't care for monuments made from moments. He didn't need plaques or parades. He understood that presence didn't always require repetition. Sometimes it just needed to happen once, at the right time in the right place, and it would echo far longer than any return visit could. After the dust settled in Millstone, after the lawsuits were filed and settled, after the precinct was turned inside out and rebuilt brick by ethical brick, Shaq faded back into the rhythm of his private life. No press tour, no documentary deals, no tell-all memoir. For him, the story wasn't about himself. He had been a catalyst, not a character. He knew his role, and once it was played, he stepped off the stage with the kind of grace few public figures ever manage. But the impact lingered. In neighborhoods where stories like Jericho's were all too common, the footage of that day became more than viral. It became reference. In training rooms, rookie officers were shown the clip not as a warning but as a mirror. In classrooms, kids studying media justice analyzed the subtlety of Shaq's actions. How he never raised his voice. How he stood without threatening. How he used a phone call like a lever beneath a broken machine. In barbershops, the name Big Shaq was no longer just tied to backboards and shoe lines. It meant something quieter, something heavier. That man didn't just shut it down. One barber in Memphis said, he lifted the whole rug. But Shaq himself didn't dwell on it. He returned to his foundations, visiting schools, attending youth mentorship programs, showing up at community centers without notice, paying tabs at local grocery stores when parents couldn't, and leaving without waiting for thanks. His life was not performance. It was pattern. He believed in showing up when no one asked, and leaving before anyone made a show of it. He took more walks, spent more time at the gym not for the cameras, but because peace lived in sweat and silence. He reconnected with his mother, Lucille, more often, the two of them sitting in silence over tea, sharing stories that didn't need headlines. Sometimes they spoke of the diner, but only briefly. Lucille would ask, "You ever think about that man?" And Shaq would nod, slow and steady. Every day, he'd answer. But he never said much more. He didn't have to. His actions had already said enough. Jericho Boone now lived in Atlanta, working full-time with the West Point Foundation. He had a modest apartment, a community of fellow veterans, and after months of searching, a reconnecting thread to his daughter, who had been living in Virginia under a new name, quietly rebuilding her own life away from the shadow of her father's unknown story. They exchanged letters then phone calls. Then finally, a visit, an embrace 17 years overdue. When asked what brought them back together, Jericho simply said, "Truth moves faster when someone clears the road." In an interview he gave to a veteran-led podcast months after the incident, Jericho reflected not on the moment he was cuffed, but on the moment Shaq stood. "I didn't need saving," he said. "I just needed someone to see me." And that perhaps was the most lasting part of Shaq's intervention. Not the influence he wielded, not the legal machinery he quietly set in motion, but the principle he left behind. See what others won't. Be present, be brave, be loud where it counts, and quiet where it matters most. In cities far from Millstone, other incidents began to shift. More phones emerged, not just to record but to intervene. More community members began to attend precinct meetings. More veterans received follow-ups from agencies that had ignored them for years. Not all change was seismic, but all of it traced its roots to the wake Shaq had left behind. Some people thought he'd do more. They expected him to launch a foundation named after the incident, to become the new face of police reform. But Shaq turned down every such offer. He wasn't interested in building a brand out of one man's pain. He didn't want to be commodified justice. His mission, if it had a name, was simpler than any campaign could sell. Use your platform, then give it away. He never once mentioned Duke Randall or Kyle Marin by name, in public, not out of mercy, but out of clarity. The story wasn't about them. It was about a pattern, about a man almost forgotten, about the difference one moment could make when someone chose presence over passivity. On the anniversary of the incident, a mural was painted on the side of a community center in Millstone. It didn't feature Shaq's face. It featured a coffee cup steaming resting on a diner table. Above it, a folded flag, and beside it the words, "You are not invisible." The artist never signed their work. They didn't have to. Shaq drove past it once, quietly, his windows rolled down, the air humming with a Georgia summer heat that settled into the bones. He nodded once, not stopping, just enough to take it in. Then he drove on. There would be no sequel. No final scene where he returned to the diner, shook hands, or took a victory lap. Because that wasn't how change worked. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow, earned, built through quiet exits and deliberate choices. Shaquille O'Neal left Millstone without ceremony. No entourage, no farewell wave. Just a man who showed up, did what was right, and moved on. The town changed. The people shifted. Systems bent towards something better. And the world, those who paid attention were left with something not easily shaken. An image of a giant rising not in anger, but in stillness. A call not shouted, but made with purpose. And a message that didn't need to be spoken twice. Be present. Be brave. Be loud where it counts. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Let it begin with you. Look around. Speak up. Show up. Be the quiet force that changes everything when it matters most. Because the next Jericho might be in your town. And the next call, it just might be yours to make.